Good morning. Hi, everybody. My name is Cristina Bacalso. I'm happy to be here. I was your rapporteur for the last 2.5 days. And before I start, I just wanted to give a very warm thanks to our rapporteurs in the parallel sessions. Thank you to all of you who sat and took notes and also listened very carefully to your colleagues and to the participants here. And I hope I can do it justice in terms of wrapping up our conference today. So I wanted to start with a quote, because as much as this conference this week was about agency, about young people's participation, about hope, about action, it was very obvious and very palpable from the beginning that we're also really talking about grief. So I wanted to start on that note. What if it is the grief of the forest registering in our bodies and psyches, and the sorrow of the redwoods, voles, sorrel, ferns, owls and deer, all those who lost their homes and lives as a result of this plunder of living beings? What if we are not separate from the world at all? We know and feel in our bones that something primal is amiss. Our extended home is being eroded, as is the experience of our wider self. It is essential that we stop and recognize these losses. It is good manners to respond with sorrow, outrage, and apology at these places touched by so much loss. And this is from Francis Weller, who wrote a book, The Edge of Sorrow, which is about grief, and it's about grief of other people, but also for our planet and for the world. And today I wanted to try my best to bring together the many threads of this very complex and complicated but really important topic of climate action and young people. 5 years ago, I was the rapporteur for the future of young people's participation, political participation, here in this building at the European Youth Center. And I think that in comparison, when I reflect on the conversations back then and when I reflect on the conversations now, we see nowhere else, I think, in the area of youth participation, so much ambivalence and so much tension. And I think that this is really about the moment that we are at today. When we look at young people in climate action and we look at the climate crisis, we're no longer just talking about mitigation. We're not talking about how to avoid a climate crisis. It's here. And so we're also talking about adaptation. And it's because of the nature of that crisis that I think when we talk about young people's action, there is a lot of tension and a lot of ambivalence. It's not just about how to act, but if it is worth acting at all. It's not just about what change we want to aim for, but what change is actually reasonable to expect at this time and moment. And so it's about prevention, yes, it still is about prevention, but I think it's also about survival together. And I think that this image is really about what do we build from the ashes? How do we go forward knowing that some things are going to be lost, but how do we still find hope amongst that? In the next slides, I'll try to go through the three main themes that our lovely facilitators here have constructed these days, these past few days. We looked at the complexity of the problem. We tried to understand what is our place of action. And then we also wanted to be able to look forward. We wanted to understand the backsliding of our democracies, the shrinking civic space. We know that young people, your action in this is really telling us about where we are as a society, and I think that it's important for us to stop and to reflect on that. My main role as rapporteur is to actually listen. So I was privileged to be able to sit back and to just observe. And so this presentation is made up of quotes. They're mostly quotes from you, quotes from presentations, quotes also from the parallel sessions. And again, I thank our rapporteurs for being able to be so diligent with that. My other role, of course, is to synthesize. And the synthesis, though, that takes time, and that will come in a following report in the next weeks. But today it's going to just be wrapping up a summary of the conversations. So our first task is really to explore this complexity. What is the scope of the problem that we have at hand? We opened in the very first day about this tall order, this need to find solutions to both our twin problems of 2024, of this century, solving the climate crisis, but also saving democracy. And the director for democracy at the Council of Europe, Matthias Grunden, he had tied these two concepts together. And the reason why they're linked is because when we talk about climate action, we are talking about our space for activism. But we're also talking about the fact that the climate crisis is putting pressure on our democracies. The impacts of the climate crisis is fueling right-wing radicalism, and also in some cases providing rationale for right-wing populism, such as eco-bordering, which is a concept that many of us were introduced to by Emir in the keynote presentation. And as such, the climate crisis is a social crisis. We're not simply just talking about ecological challenges, we're talking about polarization, we're talking about misinformation, we're talking about the resulting poverty, migration, wars that are happening from the climate crisis. It's also shaking our economic models to the core, our social models, our democratic models. And in our working group, Multiple Insecurities, we discussed the ways in which these different insecurities are intersecting. And the social crisis really then means that our responses need to also be taking into consideration social justice. And this is where we started to explore maybe how social justice and climate crisis come together in a concept of climate justice. And I know that this is still contested. We heard from many of you that perhaps this is not really a term that is something that we can wrap our heads around yet. Maybe it's only coming from civil society. Maybe we don't really have a firm grasp yet on what climate justice is. But Emir had introduced a concept to us, and I think that what is clear is that we know that in our responses, we want to be able to have both consideration of vulnerable people as well as the vulnerability of our planet. And how do we hold both of those important challenges in mind? And fundamentally, this is about inclusion. This is about inclusion in our responses, in the voices that are represented. Which people are at the podium, who gets to speak, but also who is standing next to us in the rally or as we paste our hands to the pavement. Who are the people that are beside us? But this is also about who are we taking into consideration when we talk about the green transition? Who are the people that are going to be most impacted by the proposals that we make? We're thinking about the rural families, the rural young people whose material conditions and material livelihoods are also going to be undergoing change. How do we make sure that we bring them along, that we don't fuel alienation in our strive to also save the planet? And part of this is for us to also really tackle root causes. We heard a lot about that this week, including in our keynote from Anuna. We know that climate change is also simply a symptom of larger systems of overconsumption, of profit motive due to capitalism, of the ravaging and polluting of global South countries due to colonialism, white supremacy, imperialism. And how do we tackle that? How do we tackle systemic challenges without feeling like we're just putting a Band-Aid solution over things? Because the deeper we go, the more complex or challenging the nature of change starts to become. How do we begin to change things when the problems are so deep, are so systemic? How do we get young people to feel confident that small steps also matter? And faced with this enormity, faced with these existential questions, faced with the largeness of this problem, we find that our emotions are coming into play. And I think of all of the conferences and research seminars I've been to on political participation, I don't think I have ever seen so much discussion about emotions and activism and the social challenges that we face than here this week. And I think that the emotions with mental health, with eco-anxiety, should become a fundamental part of our discussions when we talk about the challenges that young people face and how to tackle them. And we had a working group specifically on mental health and eco-anxiety to discuss just that. We were also introduced, or at least I was introduced, to this concept of solastalgia, of the opposite of nostalgia, of wanting to have a future you know you should have, that you deserve to have, but simply will never be able to have. And again, this brings back to this idea of what do we do in the face of this large challenge. In comparison, again, to 5 years ago, and I can't help but making the comparison, and other conferences on youth participation, the situation was often more straightforward. You know, we thought, okay, well, how do we tackle youth political participation? Well, we need more youth councils. We need more co-management. You know, I think in a way, our approach to those challenges were a lot more simple, but I think here we're dealing with something on a very different level. And I think when we think about understanding the action, then when we're faced with this complexity, fundamentally we're asking ourselves two important questions. What is possible and who is with us? And the conversations that we had over these few days starts to get a little bit closer to that, but I think that this is a question in motion, and we still need to grapple with this. We are faced with the age-old question of working from within the system or outside of it. Are we pushing for reform inside COP, inside the halls of policymaking, or is anything short of revolution going to be what we need to be able to tackle this planetary challenge? We heard from Anuna on the first day that out of 1,500 climate policies, only 63 have actually worked. And this really starts to chafe against our concept of what we think our aim for our change should be. Where should our energies go? Where should our activism be directed towards? But the challenge is that even when we want to work outside the system, when we know that protest and challenging narratives and bringing policymakers to task and to account is what we want to do, there are challenges to this. State repression, criminalization of climate protests around the world. Also, capital hand in hand with private security companies together with state security. And we can think about our colleagues and our fellow protesters, land defenders, water defenders in places like South America and in Asia who are constantly criminalized and also facing severe repression and in some cases death. We know that activism in climate is not an easy thing, and especially in contexts where we have lack of respect for rule of law and a less than democratic context. And we have heard that from some of our participants here. Activism is not so easy. But even when youth want to work within the system, even when we want to be able to search for compromise, to talk the talk and walk the walk together with policymakers, we feel like we're being platformed but not listened to, that youth washing is happening all over the place. And this delegitimization of spaces, of these platforms and participation frameworks that are created for young people, when they are delegitimized and not taken seriously, this is when young people are pushed to more radical means. However, when they're pushed to more radical means, then they're criminalized. And so yet again, young people are put between a rock and a hard place in terms of how do they actually advocate for their interests and the interests of the planet. And our scope for action is so wide, it's hard to know where to put our energies. We had a very interesting debate yesterday in plenary about this idea of global versus local action. You know, we have skepticism out there. Where is it actually going to make a difference? Is it going to be in my hometown with my community, or do we need to go big or go home? And we had two working groups which looked both at these different levels of scope of the global and the local. And there's no clear answer. People feel ambivalent. It depends on their context. It depends on where they themselves feel to be most efficacious. But what was clear for a lot of people too in the formal processes, that simply bureaucracy is slow, policy change is slow, and we can see that in our working group on climate litigation. It is a powerful tool, but it is slow, and sometimes in the meantime, we see compromises made on the climate agenda. But really fundamental to a lot of our conversations about what change looks like is that we're also looking for cultural change. We are looking for mindset change. It's about the conversations, talking and listening to those people across the hall, at the dinner table, to your friends and family. It's about the slow work of changing a culture one by one, and this often will take place at a local level, but this also is about our advocacy campaigns. How do we talk about climate change in a way that counters the disbelief, the misinformation? how do we tackle the information crisis that we have alongside the climate crisis? And within this, we also relived and came back to our emotions, about the important role of emotions in guiding our actions. This more than human element of the climate crisis. We're not simply just talking about technical fixes, we're talking about our existence. And so how do we come back to ourselves? And again, the Working Group on Mental Health and Climate Emotions focused very much on this. So the question is, what do we do next, right? We need to look forward. We're here, we know the enormity of the challenge, we know in some ways the options for action. How do we go forward? In 2018, a professor, Jem Bedell, had coined this term transformative adaptation. And it's not answers, it's not specific ways of what to do next, but rather perhaps a framework for us to be able to both face up to the climate tragedy that we face. But it's not about giving up. It's an invitation to explore new paths and develop a new agenda for us to retool the way that we think. And I think that transformative adaptation starts with understanding that we need everybody. We need everybody and we need all techniques. We need to break down dichotomies, which is also what we heard yesterday in the plenary. Dean Spade, a civil rights lawyer, activist, and writer on mutual aid from the United States, talks about building our solidarity muscle. And this solidarity muscle is what we need to be able to join from the above ground activists and the below ground activists, as he calls them. The above ground activists who are the ones that want to work on policy change, on the technical fixes, who want to be able to also stand and sit with policymakers, but also the below ground land defenders, those who want to hand out flyers, who hang out in the trees and in our sit-ins and want to push for civil disobedience. We need to find those spaces where we can join in solidarity together, because we actually need all approaches. We need to shake it from all corners. And we also need to be aware in which ways sometimes we are undoing each other, sometimes we might be undermining each other. But I actually think that there are more places for solidarity, for reinforcement, for co-joining our efforts than there are conflict. And I think here at this seminar, at the symposium, we have a golden opportunity. I want to just go back to what Mathias Grunden said yesterday, for those of you who were at the gala. He had said very clearly, and I quote him on this, "We will have meaningful follow-up to your recommendations." And by we, he means the Council of Europe. And so this is what I'm doing here, is to call everyone to hold the Council of Europe, to hold the Youth Partnership to task, to account. Because they are one of the actors, perhaps one of the actors that we need to be able to have in this fight. And they are asking for your recommendations, and they are committing to following up on them. And of course, the Council of Europe does not work on climate policy. It doesn't work on industrial policy. It's in the area of soft law. It works in different areas, but it does work on democracy, and it works on civic space, and it talks to governments, and it has that platform where perhaps we don't have that platform, and it has the ear to the EU where maybe us as individuals or us as young people don't have the ear to the EU. So I would encourage us to use this commitment and really hold them to account. And the next few slides are actually, I'm not going to read through them, but it's just from your ideas already, starting from this morning, from the different workshops for your brainstorming in terms of what you want to see from the Council of Europe, and by extension also the European Union, the European Commission, through the Youth Partnership, to be able to have more spaces like this, to be able to amplify the work that you're doing. That's also part of how we tackle this challenge, is using all of the different avenues that are being offered and to really hold them to account. And I think that this opportunity, while it seems small, I think also still goes a long way to be able to take advantage of the fact that there are institutions out there that are wanting to be able to platform the voices of youth, to also use their role to hold young people, to help young people hold their governments to account. And so in the coming period, I would encourage all of us, let's be bold, let's take care of each other, let's feel sorrow but also be full of rage, and let's dream of common futures together. Thank you very much.